What's up, everybody? Pastor Matt here. Thanks for checking into the YouTube channel. It is a dreary day here in Western Pennsylvania, and I'm noticing, you're probably noticing too, that the days are starting to get a little shorter and the nights are starting to get a little bit longer and the weather's starting to change a little bit. It's still August, but I can smell fall coming. In fact, my youngest daughter just the other day said, "Doesn't fall smell great?" And she was exactly right about that. Fall has a wonderful smell. I'm not getting ahead of myself. I'm not trying to wish my life away. Far from it. I'm just noticing a little bit of change as I get up in the mornings to do my devotions and my first workout. It's dark again, and it's obvious that the times and seasons are changing upon us quickly. Well, it's Wednesday morning. I've got about a half an hour before the rest of the staff gets here, so I figured I would take some viewer questions this morning. We have a couple of good ones. We're going to talk about what happens if you are more reformed than your spouse. Got that good question from Ryan, a question I've heard a number of times. I got a good question about the Sabbath day from Bill. I got a couple questions about Bibles and what Bibles to use. I got a question about Revelation, a bunch of good questions, one about funerals. We'll see how many we can take before I have to kind of get to work here this morning. But let's deal with the one about what if you are more reformed than your spouse first. This is from Ryan. What's up, Ryan? Ryan says, my wife was born and raised non-denomination. Her father, my father-in-law, who I have a great respect and admiration for, is the pastor of a non-denominational church. He's doctrinally sound, teaches the word without compromise. My question then is how I can lovingly lead my wife into the same boat that I am theologically in things such as infant baptism, Calvinism, covenant theology, etc. And then his second question, I'm just going to summarize for the sake of time here, is that what if your wife doesn't have the same passion as you? And here he's talking about the passion for systematic theology. Great question, Ryan. It is one that I get all the time. And first thing I guess I could say here is that while this particular question happens to be framed in the sense of the husband is out kind of ahead spiritually over the wife, there are many times I get the same question where it's exactly reversed, where the wife feels that she's making more gains in her spiritual life than her husband. Sometimes it's the wife who's kind of dragging along her husband, trying to force him to go to church, trying to get him to be a better leader in the family, trying to get him to read his Bible, trying to get him to be interested in the things of the Lord. So the fact that this question comes from a husband to a wife doesn't necessarily preclude the possibility that it couldn't be reversed, other than, of course, the husband has, as I understand it, I'm a complementarian when it comes to gender roles. The husband does have the responsibility before God to lead his wife and his children well in the Lord. And so when the question is kind of reversed, then we have another wrinkle to it happening here where the husband seems to be abdicating his role as leader of the family, spiritually speaking. But Ryan, I think your question is a pretty common one. I bet you that a lot of viewers that watch this video are going to be able to relate to this because I get the question quite often. Actually, I'm surprised I've never dealt with this question before. So let me just start off a little bit autobiographically here. There is no question that I am far more interested in theology than my wife. I have a beautiful wife, a wonderful wife. She loves Jesus. She loves the church. She serves the church in a number of ways, but a lot of that service is in different areas than I'm particularly interested in. For instance, my wife does a lot of things that I've never done. I was asking her just the other day about our children's ministry because I'm never there. I'm always teaching up in the sanctuary with the adults, and she's often down there leading the crafts and things like this for the kids group, kids club. And I was just asking her, like, how does it even work? Because I don't even know. I'm never down there. I think, Ryan, one of the things that you have to do is just understand that Paul's analogy of the membership of the church family in their various roles and various functions is going to be true for you and for your wife as well. You're going to have different gifts. You're going to have different interests, and that's only natural because all of us have slightly different spiritual gifts, though sometimes they overlap. Sometimes it's the differences between our spiritual gifts that actually make our church stronger, and in the same way make your family stronger. So the fact that you have more interest in Reformed theology than your wife doesn't necessarily concern me yet. Now, there could be some moments in which this does become a problem. For instance, you mentioned that infant baptism may become a problem for you, especially if you're inclined to have your children baptized and she is not. That is going to be a bit of a problem for you, and you're going to have to resolve that in one way or the other. I would simply say that I don't necessarily see this being a problem unless you start to sense these kinds of tensions that are going to be real problems in the future, such as what church can we even attend if we have different convictions. I definitely would not want you to be in a situation where you're attending different churches on Sunday mornings. I have seen that done on a number of occasions. Very often it's with a Roman Catholic and a Protestant. They try to go to both services or switch every other. I don't think that works out very well. I've seen also that they don't even try to rotate. They just each go to their own separate congregation. I think that's going to be a real problem. I definitely wouldn't want to see you get into that kind of a situation. Probably for me, Ryan, the best thing that I have tried to do is to simply lead my wife and my family by way of example. Now, my wife was raised in the church, raised in a charismatic church, Assemblies of God. So she has a ton of Bible background in her, just raised in a church where there's expository preaching, but obviously not Reformed. And so as we were in our early 20s, and I don't know how old you are, Ryan, we had to kind of figure things out. I mean, one of the things is I got a job at a Presbyterian church, and so we kind of got a crash course in Reformed theology in my early 20s as we were figuring out some of these things even together. There were answers that I didn't have and questions that we both kind of shared. I will say this, even though I've never been able to get my wife to sit down and read a book on Jonathan Edwards, for instance, which obviously I love, and she just doesn't have the interest. I've tried. It's not there. It's okay. She just contributes in so many other ways in the church, making meals for the potlucks and all kinds of things in our children's ministry, women's ministry, always behind the scenes, whereas I'm up front. I'm always, with a mic in my hand or on my ear, and my wife is the furthest thing away from a microphone ever. But I've grown to love and to cherish my wife for just who she is and the fact that her interests are very different from mine. She's not so much a reader as I am a reader, and she's certainly not a writer as I am a writer. I would say, Ryan, probably the best thing you can do is to lead your family in well-structured family devotions. I don't know if you're doing that already, but that's probably going to be the best way to do it. Well-structured family devotions over a long period of time, if you do it every night at dinner time, you are going to be able to teach your wife and your children some of the most important things related to theology, but to do so in a way that doesn't require her to sit down and read 6 volumes of Francis Turretin or something like that, or the whole Institutes of the Christian Religion by John Calvin or something like that. You may be able to do that. It may very well be the case that she has no interest in doing something like that, but that doesn't mean that you can't lead 4, 5, 10-minute devotions after dinner in which you begin to slowly explain and to set these things forth not only for your wife but for your children. In regards to infant baptism, I've got several videos on that particular topic. There's a bunch of good books that you can read on that topic. So just dig into that, but put it out there a little bit at a time. Emphasize, for instance, the importance of family, the importance of the covenant in the families, and the importance of children in the covenants, including the families, and that may be helpful for her. But Ryan, don't panic if you have interests that are different from hers, or even if you find yourself gaining spiritually faster than her, don't panic necessarily. It's going to be okay. In fact, there may be some times, if you give it a while, and again, I don't know how old you are, but let's say you're young, just for the sake of discussion, there may be some time, some years, even some decades where her growth outpaces yours. So it could be kind of a tortoise and the hare sort of a thing where you sprint out real quick because you're growing super fast in the Lord, but her slow and steady pace may end up eventually catching up to you, if not passing you altogether. So just continue to pray for her, do your family devotions, lead her to church, exemplify Christ-likeness in every possible way, including your patience to her, and the Lord will be good and be gracious to you, I'm quite sure. All right, this next question comes from Vito. Vito from Middle Tennessee. He says, I'm curious to know how far freedom of conscience runs in the Presbyterian tradition. Here are my questions, and he asks a bunch of them. I don't know if I'm going to get all of them, Vito. He says, can you be a Presbyterian without affirming paedobaptism? In other words, can you be a Presbyterian credo Baptist? And then he asks a little bit about the flexibility related to the Westminster Standards. In other words, how explicitly do you need to subscribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith? All right, well, let me just try to take a couple of those questions. First of all, this. Probably, Vito, the most important distinction I can make here when you ask if a Presbyterian can be a credo Baptist is to simply state that it's going to be a little bit different in terms of the expectations between a member of a Presbyterian church and a leader of a Presbyterian church. And I don't have enough from your question to know exactly what you meant by this. If I might have missed a part of your question, I just copied and pasted this from your email into my notes here on my screen. But members can certainly have differing views from the Westminster Confession of Faith. In fact, if you go to the Book of Church Order, now I'm in the PCA, so I can't answer for every single Reformed Presbyterian body there is, but I'll tell you in the PCA, ordinary members of a congregation do not take vows of strict ascription to the Westminster Confession of Faith. There are 5 or so questions related to joining a church when you take a vow of membership for church and as a member, and they are related to your profession of faith in Christ, your acknowledgement of your sin, the fact that you appeal to Christ alone for salvation and not of yourself. There's a vow of promising to live as becomes a follower of Christ, and then there's a vow of submission to the leadership of the church. So there is no strict subscription to the Westminster Confession of Faith or the larger or the shorter catechisms for those who are joining as a member. So I have no doubts that in my congregation right now at Gospel Fellowship PCA, I have some people that lean Credo Baptist. I can think of at least one individual who's pretty strongly Credo Baptist and yet loves the church, worships with us, has a difference in terms of sacramental views with the rest of our leadership. He's not a leader, actually just a regular old member. But yeah, that is entirely possible. So if your question, Vito, is can you join a church as a member and be a Credo Baptist, the answer to that is yes. Now, let's take that question one step further. If your question is, can I be a ruling elder or a teaching elder, that is to say a pastor in a Presbyterian church, then I'm going to give a different answer, because here, to be an elder or a teaching elder, you do have to make explicit your differences from the Westminster Confession of Faith. There should be an explicit knowledge and disclosure of anything that you have that differs from the Westminster Confession and catechisms when you take a vow of eldership within the church. So if you're going to be a ruling elder in a congregation, you will have to make known to the session, the rest of the elders, what your differences are between your views and the Westminster Confession of Faith. You might even need to make that explicit on paper so that the rest of the session can evaluate that and determine whether or not you're fit to serve as a leader in said congregation. If you want to be a teaching elder, which is a pastor in a Presbyterian church, then yeah, the subscription there is going to be even more rigorous. You're going to have to not only write out explicitly what your exceptions are to the confessions, but you're also going to have to defend them verbally before the presbytery as you're being received. I used to have, when I was in the EPC, several little quibbles with the Westminster Confession, which I wrote out and defended before the Presbytery of Florida when I was in the EPC. Later, I ended up removing my exceptions because after further study, I found that I totally agreed and wanted to comport even more fully with the Confession of Faith. And so when I transferred into the Ascension Presbytery here in the PCA, switch presbytery, switch denominations, I did not bring any exceptions with me of the Westminster Confession of Faith. Had I done so, I would have had to write them out, explain them, and then defend myself before the presbytery to make those explicit. And I will tell you this, in the PCA, it is unlikely then that you would be received as a teaching elder. Veritably impossible, though I can't say it's never happened, to become a teaching elder or a pastor if you had a Credo Baptist perspective. And the reason for that is because it is so markedly different from what the Reformed confessions, and especially the Westminster Confession of Faith, state about word and sacrament ministry and the importance of particularly the sacrament of baptism. So I don't think that that would work out for you in that sense. But as a member, yes, you can join a Presbyterian church and disagree with us. You don't have to take vows of subscription or explicitly state your differences. As a ruling elder or teaching elder, yes, you would have to do so. All right, Stephen says, I've enjoyed your sermons on the book of Joel. I'm especially pleased to hear that your next series is going to be on the book of Revelation. Thank you very much, Stephen. I appreciate that compliment. My training and all my commentaries reflect the premillennial viewpoint, but I've become dissatisfied with this interpretation. Can you recommend any commentaries written from the amillennial viewpoint? He says, I would love to do more study to coincide with your messages. Oh, cool. Well, thanks, Stephen. That's really nice of you. Yeah, I'm going to work with a couple of commentaries. One of them I left at home. I was going to show them to you. One of them is by a guy called Douglas Kelly, and it's a commentary on the book of Revelation done by Mentor, which is from Christian Focus out in the UK. So I would have held that one up for you to show you, but unfortunately I left it at home. I will tell you this, that David O'Leary and I, my associate pastor, who's going to be preaching every third or fourth message or so in that series, as he always does, we're going to be relying kind of heavily on this commentary by G.K. Beale. It's called a shorter commentary on the book of Revelation, but don't let that name throw you because it comes in at 550 pages on the book of Revelation. This is the shorter commentary. His longer commentary is part of the, if I'm not mistaken, New International Critical Commentary on the New Testament, the Nikant series. And where this is actually an abridgment of that. So we're going to be using both of those. David has the longer one. I don't have the longer one. I've got the shorter one. G.K. Beale is really, really good in terms of the book of Revelation. We also depended upon him for the Thessalonian series, which we just completed. So, Stephen, I would say grab a hold of this one as well as the Douglas Kelly commentary from Mentor. You know, Calvin never wrote a commentary on the book of Revelation, so we can't really use John Calvin at all, so we have to use some other things. I also use Matthew Henry and some other stuff. Sometimes I find what the best way to do it is to simply find a commentary that you really trust by an author that you know and you can really rely upon, and use that as your main commentary while also splicing in other viewpoints from others who may disagree with the main commentator that you're using, so you can get some of the other nuances and wrinkles that the one main guy doesn't see. Now, because you asked about Revelation and amillennialism, I just want to throw this out for you too. Here's a good book on amillennialism by Kim Riddlebarger. I've mentioned this one a couple times before in other videos. You might want to check this one out too. I think this is pretty good stuff. There's another one by Sam Storms. He's a Reformed Baptist as far as I understand. It's kind of weird though, Reformed Baptist charismatic, so I don't lean on that one as much, but he does have some good exposition on several of the more difficult passages. And his book is pretty straight up the line amillennial as far as that goes. But this Kim Riddlebarger on amillennialism would be a very good introduction to the topic. It'll give you the main outline of what amillennialism is, and this Revelation shorter commentary by Beale should be fantastic. And if you follow along with the sermon series, you're going to get a little bit of Beale implied behind the scenes, perhaps. All right, Jack says, having reached 65 years, I've noticed that I'm attending more funerals and memorial services than I once did. Well, yeah, that's gonna happen. I feel the same way, my brother. Some of these services have preached the gospel, while others, even for professing Christians, have sent me away shaking my head. He says, lately I've given some thought as to what I would want from my memorial service. My pastor suggested that I write out a service that would include scriptures that I would want read and hymns that I would want sung. I think that's a fantastic idea. Jack, you're right. There's certainly a trend towards services that really exalt the person who has deceased rather than in the gospel. And that's something that we really want to make sure we have well balanced as Bible-believing Christians. I've done a number of funerals myself, and I will tell you this, that's always one of the things that I'm thinking about is, A, how do I honor this person who presumably is a believer that is now with the Lord, giving a faithful recitation, the story of their life. I want people that come to the funeral to know the person better than they did before, to hear some wonderful stories about them, some of their main accomplishments, their sense of humor, things like this. All that is good. However, our main focus in funerals or memorial services is to preach the gospel. We want our people coming away, anybody who comes, to hear the gospel. Jack, in some ways, it is true, isn't it, that the funeral is the best opportunity to preach the gospel. After all, we're thinking about life and death. We're thinking about heaven and hell. We're thinking about what happens to the soul after it leaves the body. We might even have a dead body in the room that we can point to and say, this is what becomes all of us eventually, because we're mortal, and yet there's part of us that is immortal, the soul. And what is going to happen to your immortal soul upon the deceasing of your body? Your brain activity and your heart will stop one day. You know that. That's why you're thinking about these things. So, Jack, I think a good worship service that focuses on the gospel would flow something like this. And this is just off the top of my head, but this is very often what we do here at Gospel Fellowship. Pastor comes out, gives a welcome to the congregation, greets those who are visiting from afar, maybe a couple things about what's going to happen after the service, if there's a reception or a graveside, give that information at the top just to kind of remind people what's happening. Certainly greeting the widow or the widower, as well as family and children, perhaps even by name, making that as personal as you possibly can. And then we begin reading some scriptures, usually from the New Testament, perhaps the Old Testament as well, with the promises of eternal life. And so there's a number of places in the service that we're going to recite scripture. There's usually a prayer, invocation, asking the Lord to be with us and to reveal the gospel of his Son throughout the proceedings. Very often there may be some recited scripture, such as the Lord's Prayer or the 23rd Psalm. If the family is so inclined, we will very often sing hymns together or psalms together. Often I kind of let the family give me some indication as how much singing they want in the service. Sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it's not. Sometimes I've done services where there's nobody to help me lead the music. At a funeral home, for instance, you may not have a piano or an organ, and so that's kind of determined by the circumstances. I like to sing the great hymns of the faith. I find that greatly uplifting myself, so I would recommend at least 2 to 3 hymns to be sung. I'm not a super big fan of performance music during the funeral time. I'm not necessarily opposed to it either, but that wouldn't necessarily be my preference. If there are testimonies to be shared by people who've come to the memorial service, I like them to be just a few in number, 2 or 3 perhaps, as they tend to be somewhat repetitive if you get more than that. And I like to know who they are ahead of time so that you don't kind of get the wild firebrand type of stranger weirdo saying all kinds of things about reincarnation or grandma became a butterfly or anything like that. That's what I really want to prevent. So I want to know as a pastor who's going to give a testimony, what are they going to say? And then I make sure that I preach the gospel using an exposition of a text such as, well, gosh, I guess you could really use anything here, couldn't you? 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, anything from the book of Revelation on heaven, several of the death or burial scenes of the great patriarchs of the faith in the Old Testament, any of the Psalms, anything on the book of life. I mean, I've done so many different ones. The thief on the cross, depending on whose funeral I'm doing. Very often I will think about the person who has died and preach a sermon that is kind of befitting of that person's life, if that makes sense. So whenever I've preached a funeral for somebody who's just recently been converted, maybe towards the very end of their life, I might preach on the thief on the cross. If it's somebody who's been faithful unto the Lord their whole life long, maybe you preach on Dorcas from the book of Acts or something like that. I try to pick a text that's suitable to the person. And then, of course, there may be another hymn and then finally a benediction. But Jack, you're exactly right. Way too many memorial services. You don't hear the gospel at all. That's a problem. It's a problem. Yep. All right, a couple more here and then we'll be out of here. Bible Guy, not a Thomist from Twitter. Cool handle, buddy. It says, hi, what's your daily driver Bible? Well, if you've been hanging out with me for a while, you already know what it is. It's the Cambridge Wide Margin. It's recently been renamed the Aquila. It used to just be called the Cambridge Wide Margin, but I started calling this thing the Eagle because of its great wingspan several years ago, and Cambridge actually just rebranded the whole line as the Aquila, which is Latin for eagle, actually kind of as a homage to my my faithful dedication to this book. So yeah, this is my daily driver. It's a little bit big to take everywhere, but I still do put it in my backpack every day, read devotions out of it, read it in the evenings, preach and teach out of it, even though the font is a little bit small. I just have too many notes in this Bible to abandon it at this point. But eventually, maybe I will, who knows, though I love it right now. So yeah, definitely my daily driver. Got lots of other Bibles that I use. In fact, that leads me to the next question. Pastor and Prophet, also from Twitter, says, Matthew, I love your videos, especially your Bible reviews. Thank you. Not doing so many these days, but still a little bit every once in a while. Says, I'm really curious about how you manage multiple Bibles when it comes to study, daily carry, reading, etc. Yeah, that's true. Even as I just showed you my daily driver, I have several Bibles that I use all the time. In fact, there's a couple that are in my rotation that I really, really depend on, even daily. So calling one a daily driver is a little bit of a misnomer because I do use multiple Bibles regularly. First of all, my Greek text, use that quite a bit. Secondly, I have an ESV study Bible that has been rebound by Leonard's, which I use for our family devotions, use that all the time. I have another ESV study Bible, there it is right there, which I've done a review on. This one's my at church one, the other one's my at home one, but I use the ESV study Bible quite a bit. I have a King James Bible that I am reading currently devotionally in the evening. I have my interleaved Edwardsian ESV with every other page blank for note-taking, which was rebound by Rustic Leatherworks. Use that all the time. I put my best sermon notes in that one. Yeah, it's a bit of a mess, and I do have notes everywhere, but that's not a problem for me. You know, I've done so many videos on note-taking systems, so I do have notes everywhere. I have my miscellaneous notebook right there, which I write a lot of notes in, as well as several other notebooks besides. I have my digital miscellaneous, so I've got stuff everywhere. You know, I don't know what your first name is, Pastor and Prophet from Twitter, but the key is that you're learning all the time. Don't freak out if you have notes at home or at work or in your file or on your phone. Just keep taking notes and studying God's Word. That's the best way, just to keep on going. Zach says, what's up, Zach? How much time should I spend reading the Bible versus reading works of Calvin, Berkhoff, Voss, the Westminster Confession of Faith, etc.? Zach, put all of your effort in the Bible, your primary effort, I should say. Be reading the Bible every day and all the time. Be reading the Bible sequentially all the way through. When you finish that, start over again. Zach, I would simply say always read the Bible and don't read anything else until you read the Bible. Having said that, yes, there is, of course, plenty of room to be studying other things to help fill out our faith, in addition to, but never a replacement of, the Bible. So here's my Confession of Faith, the Westminster. You asked about that. I read it once a year, usually in January. Whenever the calendar flips over to January, I start over reading the confession. It only takes me a few days, but I find it's good to keep my brain refreshed in that. As for other works, I tend to kind of work slowly through them. I've read the Institutes all the way through, but I'm kind of reading it through slowly again. John Frame's Systematic Theology has been helpful to me. Berkhoff has been helpful to me. You mentioned that. I tend to read those things as reference works, though, rather than straight through. For instance, in my copy of Berkhoff, I always check off the paragraphs and the sections when I complete them, because I am tracking it in the table of contents to see if I and when I ever get through the whole thing. Same thing with Frame, Systematic Theology. But I tend to read that as reference works. For instance, whatever I'm teaching about, if that topic comes up, I'll look it up and read the section, check it off. But I tend not to read through Systematic Theologies cover to cover necessarily. But I would say this, Zach, always be reading your Bible, okay, and always do it first as your main priority, but then always be also reading something else that's going to help you to specialize in particular areas and generalize in others, okay? I hope that's of some help to you. Finally, Bill says, I could use your help on something. I'm in the Marine Corps. When I travel for work, there are a handful of times a year, 4 to 8 times per year, that I might be required to work on Sundays. I recently submitted a request for religious exemption. They didn't technically deny it, but they did say that if a mission requires it, I will have to work on Sundays. I'm not sure how I feel about that or what I can do from there. Well, Bill, it is important to be Sabbatarian. The Sabbath day is one of the commandments of God. It is in the 10 Commandments, of course. And Reformed believers especially have a robust view of the Sabbath because our confessional statements still acknowledge it. We don't think it's the one commandment that's been tossed out and that there are 9 commandments left. No, we think that we are to honor the Sabbath day by acknowledging the Lord's Day, which is Resurrection Day. We can get in debates on which day we should take as our day of rest, whether it be Saturday or Sunday, or whether it should start at midnight or start at nightfall. But that's not really the point of your question. Your question is, what if I'm forced to work on the Lord's Day or the Sabbath day? How that violates my conviction, it would seem. Don't want to put words in your mouth, but you obviously seem uncomfortable about that. What can be done? Well, Bill, even for us who are pretty strict about Sabbatarianism and we still hold to the 4th commandments, there is still nevertheless some room for what we call works of mercy and necessity. And that is to say that while we would strongly exhort and encourage people to take that Sabbath day of rest, worshiping in the congregation with the people of God, yes, that should certainly be done as a matter of practice and faith and conviction as part of our faithful response to the Lordship of Jesus. Yet at the same time, even the Westminster Confession of Faith, which would probably be considered one of the strongest Sabbatarian of the Reformed confessions, does acknowledge a place for what it calls works of mercy and necessity. And so what I'm going to read to you, Bill, is from Westminster Confession of Faith. This is chapter 21, paragraph 8. Listen to this. This Sabbath is then kept holy unto the Lord, when men, after a due preparing of their hearts and ordering of their common affairs beforehand, do not only observe and wholly rest all the day from their own works, words, and thoughts about their worldly employments and recreations, but are also taken up the whole time in the public and private exercises of his worship and in the duties of necessity and mercy. And so when you look up the biblical references there to works of necessity and mercy, what the confession does is it points us back to those many times in the Gospels where Jesus heals on the Sabbath, okay? And so he does that on purpose. It's not just once or twice, but a bunch of times Jesus heals on the Sabbath, and the question is why? Well, one of the things that Jesus is showing here is that while the Sabbath is obviously important, it's one of the creation ordinances, yet there is still plenty of room to do good on those days. And so obviously, Bill, there's going to be a lot of people that have to do their employment even on those days, because after all, if you get in a car accident, you want there to be a paramedic to come to get you, right? Somebody has to do that kind of work of mercy and necessity on the Lord's Day. Same thing too with there should be a surgeon ready in the hospital in case anybody's appendix explodes on a Sunday. You should have somebody at the nuclear plant ready to pull the lever in case radiation starts flying out everywhere. I mean, so the point is this. Even Westminsterian Sabbatarians who hold to a rigorous view of the Lord's Day or the Sabbath, we acknowledge that there are certain times in certain professions where somebody has to be on call. Somebody has to be manning the phones on the 911 system, even on the Lord's Day, because life is so valued. That's why Jesus does these healings of the man with the withered hand and others on the Sabbath day. Life is so valued that we ought to continue to do things that show that great care and concern for others. I'll visit people on the Lord's Day. I'll go to the hospitals and visit people on the Lord's Day. I don't consider that work to me because I love my people and I love to care for them. So what about the Marine Corps? Your question. Well, Bill, this would certainly seem to me, and perhaps somebody could dispute with this, to be one of those works of mercy and necessity where somebody has to be on that wall, to use a cliche, somebody has to be protecting the nation, even on the Lord's Day, because after all, there's no guarantee that our enemies are going to honor the Sabbath. And so what if we are attacked? What if there are crucial missions that need to be performed? What if there are operations that need to be done on the Sabbath day? Even though you're a Christian and you're Sabbatarian by conviction, it would certainly seem to me that this would fall under the category of works of mercy and necessity. Somebody has to do that job. Now, that's a pretty interesting example because I think it clearly falls into that area, but there are other jobs that don't fall into that category. Okay, and so you would have to, for other viewers out there who have different jobs that might not qualify, then you have to really ask yourself, is this the job for me? Have I done my due diligence in going to my manager and asking for permission? Have I expressed my sincerity that I really true and sincerely believe that I need to be in my congregation of worship and that is primary to you, and that you're even willing to walk away from the job if necessary to uphold your religious convictions? Most of the time, I think managers will finally respect that, especially in a day where hard laborers and trustworthy employees are hard to come by. Say it sincerely, say it with conviction, say it as clearly as you can, and then make your decisions from there. All right. Well, hey, thanks everybody for checking in. Hope you enjoyed this short video on Q&A. Please know that I do love you lots. Oh, before I go, I just want to mention one more time that we have our conference coming up, our Image of God conference here at Gospel Fellowship, November 11th and 12th. We're going to be talking a lot about sexual sin, all kinds of hot topics we're going to address from a Reformed, biblical, and confessional perspective. So we'd love to have you come out for that. The conference is totally free, but you do need to just register for us. That'll be very helpful for us so we know how many people are coming. Okay? Again, love you lots. Thanks for checking in, and we'll talk to you later.